It's BC for Get Lowered. Today we're going to install Paul Yaffe's Bagger Nation monkey bars on my Road King. I like the look of the Bagger Nation monkey bars, love the points on them, love the fact that they're an 1.25 inch bar and they recess down to the 1 inch in the center to make them really easy to install. Now, first thing first, we have to be able to remove the bars. And in order to do that on a Road King, you first have to remove this cover. This cover is held in place by a couple of screws that sit underneath this trim ring. And then it's held in place by a third screw in the front that sits underneath the trim piece on the top of the nacelle. In order to get to that final screw, we have to take out every piece of the headlight assembly, then we have to remove a couple of nuts underneath the nacelle, and finally we'll be able to remove the trim ring, and then we can take off the cover for the clamp. The trim ring is just held in place by a couple of little clips, so you pop it up with a thin blade screwdriver and then you can remove the screws. Now, let's walk around to the front of the bike and take a look at the headlight. My headlight is held in place by a bunch of screws. The first one sits right underneath here, so we just have to unscrew that, and then that will allow us to remove these traditional style visors that go around the headlights. So now we're going to loosen up that screw and we can pop these visors right off from the stock trim ring that goes around the light. There's a little bit of a gap there that this trim ring sits inside of. As you can see, I have a lip that goes around that trim ring. And once that lip is out of that gap, then we can start to pull off that stock trim ring that goes around the light itself. That stock trim ring is just held on by a single screw that sits down into the bottom of this. And once we get that screw out, I like to go to a flat blade screwdriver, and we can use the adjustment ports to be able to kind of wedge the flat blade screwdriver in there and pop that ring out. It's just this spring that sits in the top of it and then the screw that sits in the bottom that holds this thing in place. Next up, we have a number of screws that sit around the light itself. We have some adjustment screws, and then we have the other screws that actually hold the light into the pan behind it. There are 4 of them that go around the light, so we're going to remove those and try to leave the adjustment screws in place for right now. Those 4 screws hold on this trim ring that goes around the light, and this trim ring just holds the light in place to the adjustment pan. So make sure you hold on to these screws because they're going to go flying on you, and if you're reinstalling the light, then you definitely need them in order to get things completed. We can pull the plug out of the back of the light. It's just a 3-prong connector, like pretty much every other motorcycle light, and set the light out of the way. Next up, we have to remove these 4 adjustment screws, and once those 4 adjustment screws are removed, we can get to the wires that sit behind here. Now, pull out the 4 screws, and then you're going to have a little spring clip that sits in the bottom. A set of needle nose pliers will make easy work of that, and the spring won't go flying on you, so then you can set your adjustment tray out to the side as well. Finally, we have 8 screws that we have to remove that go around the main headlight assembly. And these 8 screws are the last thing that stand between you and getting back here into the connectors that sit inside of the nacelle. So we pull those 8 screws and then we can set the trim ring to the side, and that exposes this little nut that you can see right at the top of the frame, right up here. Once we have that nut removed, we can take off this trim piece from the top of the nacelle and finally get access to the riser clamp. So here's our riser clamp. We've just removed the cover and exposed the riser clamp itself. We can go ahead and loosen up these 4 bolts, and that will then allow us to better spot where the throttle cable sits inside of the nacelle. So we're going to go back here to the nacelle for a minute, and this is just a shot of the inside. The plug that you see in the dead center is our throttle cable, and we found that by loosening up the bars and just moving them around a little bit and seeing which one of the plugs moved. Then we also have highlighted here on the left side 2 black plugs, and on the right side 2 white plugs. Those plugs have to come out as well. And the reason that those come out is because these bars are designed to be run as an internally wired bar. There is no recess on the bottom of the bar to allow your wires to run on the outside. So go ahead and disconnect those 4 plugs, and then we'll talk about what it takes to get the wires out of those Deutsch connectors. Our next step is that we have to remove our clamshells and our controls from the top. We got T25 screws on the top and the bottom of the clamshell, and then we have T27 screws that sit on the master cylinder. It's the same on the left side as well. Now, once you have all those controls stripped off and you can move your bars around, you can take a look at the cables. And we're going to have to pull out that throttle-by-wire cable, and we're also going to have to pull out the cables with the Deutsch connectors. There is enough room at the top of the nacelle to be able to thread those out of there. It looks tight, but it actually will fit. Now we need to talk about the Deutsch connectors. Once you have them removed from the nacelle, you're going to take a fine-tipped set of needle nose pliers, and you're going to put each end into one of those center holes inside of the Deutsch connector. And then you're going to grip just lightly and pull back towards you. What that will do is release the locking mechanism on the Deutsch connector, which allows you to remove the pins. Once you've got that locking mechanism slid up, you can then push on the back of each of the pins, just the wire at the back of the connector, and you're going to slide each of these up just slightly. It's maybe 1/4 of an inch of play inside of there. So as you can see here on this connector, I have 6 pins, and so I'm going to move each of those 6 pins forward to where they are sticking out further than they were before. Next, you're going to take a straight pin or a straightened out paper clip, and you're going to stick it in the hole that sits either above or below each of those pins. You stick the pin into the hole, and then that will release the pin, allowing you to pull it out from the back of the connector. If it takes too much effort, you need to play around with the position on that pin somewhat before you try to pull the wire out. The wire should come out fairly easily. If you pull too hard, it's going to pull the wire out of the connector. Now, let's talk about the throttle-by-wire, or the twist grip sensor as Harley calls it. Now, as you can see, you've got quite a bit of stuff here that's going on this connector, and all of that has to run down through your bars. You'll notice that there's a green connector there, and that has to be pulled out and then detached in order to be able to pull one section of your throttle-by-wire through the handlebar side, and then the other section through the center hole. So now moving back to my bars, here's the green connector, and this is the connector for heated grips. Go ahead and disconnect that. And now you're going to take this green connector and disconnect that as well. And that's because you have this large connector that will not fit through the hole. And so you have to disconnect this green connector, which we're going to do by flipping the connector over, and then you'll be able to see that there is a pin that you push down, and you can pull that connector out. Once that connector is out, it then frees up the rest of the wire to be pulled out and out from the bottom holes. Now that you got your wires out, it's time to get them back in. And this is your trick. Yes, it's just beaded chain, like you'd find on dog tags or at a hardware store. And so what you're going to do is you're going to take that beaded chain and wrap it around your wires. Then you're going to wrap electrical tape around the beaded chain and your wires. You can then take that chain and drop it down the bars. The chain has enough weight that it will easily pass through the bars and then come out of your guide holes down at the bottom. With that chain and the wires connected, you can use the chain to pull the wires through the bars a little bit easier. It's still not going to be simple, it still takes a long time, but the wires will go through the bars and eventually out of the center holes. What you end up with on an internally wired bike is no wire mess, and so all you end up seeing is the brake line on one side, the clutch line on the other, and then all the rest of your wires are inside of the bars themselves. It gives a really great clean look to the installation, and I love what it's done on the Road King. Now, these actually can be installed on a Softail as well. And you don't even have to internally wire them. However, if you choose not to, you're going to want to invest into some zip ties to make sure that the wire gets cleaned up. But the look is actually pretty great. In fact, it looks a lot like it does on the Road King. Now, to find the throttle-by-wire cable, you do have to slide your gas tank back, and then the connector sits right there just underneath the gas tank itself. You don't actually have to take the gas tank off, so it's not too terrible of a job, and then the rest of your connectors just pull right out. So there you have it. Pretty dramatic difference going from the stock bars and moving over to the Paul Yaffe Bagger Nation monkey bars on the Road King. And it's not too terrible of a job. Well, except for that internal wiring. But if you have some patience, you can get the job done. Check out the full line of Paul Yaffe bars and many more. Head on over to getlower.com.